So people often ask me, do you believe in God? Which I don't like that question. First of all, it's an attempt to box me in a sense. And the reason that it's an attempt to box me in is because the question is asked so that I can be firmly placed on one side of a binary argument. And the reason I don't like to answer it is because A, I don't like to be boxed in, and B, because I don't know what the person means by believe or God. And they think they know. And the probability that they construe belief and construe God the same way I do is virtually zero. So it's a question that doesn't work for me on multiple levels of analysis. But strangely enough, just as we were talking, the answer to that question popped into my head. I act as if God exists. Now you can decide for yourself whether that means that I believe in him, so to speak. But I act as if he exists. So that's a good enough answer for that. Then with regards to these other issues, the divinity of Christ, well, I would say the same problems with the question formulation obtain. What do you mean by divine? And also, what do you mean by Christ? These are very, very difficult questions. Now, I believe that, for all intents and purposes, I believe that the Logos is divine. Insofar as if by divine you mean of ultimate value, of ultimate transcendent value, yes, it's divine. It's associated with death and rebirth, clearly, because the Logos dismantles you and rebuilds you. So that's what happens when you make an error. When you make an error, some part of you has to go. That's a sacrifice. You have to let it go. Sometimes it's a big part of you. Sometimes it can be such a big part of you that you actually die, right, instead of dying and being reborn. Is there something more than merely metaphorical about the idea of dying and being reborn? Yes, there is, because those are associated with physiological transformations. What's the ultimate extent of that? That's a good question. You know, the question is, what happens to the world around you as you increasingly embody the Logos? And the answer to that is, we don't know. We don't know what the ultimate level of this. Now, the hypothesis is, and it's a hypothesis that extends to some degree to Buddha as well, the hypothesis is that there has been one or two individuals who managed that, and that in their management of that, they transcended death itself. Well, then you might ask yourself, well, what do you mean by transcended death? Well, in the case of Christ, let's assume he was a historical figure for the time being, which I think is the simplest thing to assume. I think there's sufficient evidence to conclude that. You could conclude otherwise, but personally, I feel that there's sufficient evidence to conclude that. Is his resurrection real? Well, his spirit lives on. That's certainly the case.
In what sense do you mean spirit? Just to qualify that.
Well, let's imagine that a spirit is a pattern of being. And we know that patterns can exist, patterns can be transmitted across multiple substrates, right? Vinyl, electronic impulses, air, vibrations in your ear, neurological patterns, dance. It's all the translation of what you might describe as a spirit, right? It's that pattern. It's independent of its material substrate. Well, Christ's spirit lives on. It's had a massive effect across time. Well, is that an answer to the question? Did his body resurrect? I don't know. I don't know. The accounts aren't clear, for one thing. What the accounts mean isn't clear. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. We don't understand the world very well. We don't understand how the world could be mastered if it was mastered completely. We don't know how an individual might be able to manage that. We don't know what transformations that might make possible. You know, there's a famous quote by Nietzsche, right? I'm sure you've all heard it, and that's the quote that God is dead. So what Nietzsche said essentially was, God is dead and we have killed him. That's a different idea. And we'll never find enough water to wash away the blood. And so it wasn't like a triumphal statement on Nietzsche's part, even though when you hear it quoted, you always hear it quoted that way. It's like it's a sort of victory, God is dead, you know, or something to celebrate. It's not what Nietzsche thought at all. In fact, he thought all hell was going to break loose because of it. And he predicted as much in the 1870s. I mean, he predicted what was going to happen in the 20th century with ridiculous accuracy. Like, it's uncanny. And that's partly because, you know, Nietzsche was one of these people like Jung who are very grounded in their deep, deep, deep imaginations. And so they get wind of the currents that are moving through society long before normal people do. So in some sense, you know, you can imagine that in any given population, even when you guys, there's some of you guys who are living like 50 years ago, and there's some of you living now, and there's some of you living 50 years in the future. It depends on how intelligent, imaginative versus how conservative you are. Because it's not like everyone develops at exactly the same historical rate. And you get people like Nietzsche, for example, or Dostoevsky, they're like 100 years ahead of everyone else. And so, you know, people don't even know what to do with them. But Stendhal was like that too, the writer. He wrote in the 1830s, and he was convinced that he was 100 years ahead of his time. And stylistically, that was probably about right. So, and the people who were prophets, regarded as prophets in say, Old Testament tradition, they were the same sort of people. It's like they had their ear to the ground in a sense, and they could tell what was going on underneath everybody's facade. It echoed in them, and often, as the stories go, and I'm sure they have a mythological accuracy to them, the people who were picking up the underground currents indicating often catastrophe felt absolutely compelled, even at the risk of their own skin, to warn people. So Jung was definitely one of these people. And now, this question, God is dead and we have killed him, led Nietzsche to pose another question, which was, well, what are we going to do to replace him? Because Nietzsche believed, and I think he was absolutely right about this, I can't see how it could be otherwise. He believed that the morality that had structured Western society was predicated on the fundamental axiom of divinity. And so, like as far as Nietzsche was concerned, the whole corpus of morality was dependent on that axiom being true, or at least being accepted as true. And when that axiom was knocked out by, say, the conflict between science and religion, because in some sense that's what did it, then the whole system no longer had anything to stand on and could become entirely questionable. And so Nietzsche pointed that out, and then Dostoevsky, who was writing basically at the same time, said, well, if there's no God, then anything is permitted. And what he meant by that was, really in some sense what he meant by that was, morality turns into what you can get away with. Because there's nothing final about it, there's nothing transcendent about it. And like, we've played this problem out intellectually. You guys are still right in the middle of this battle, whether you know it or not. I mean, so what happened in the 20th century was that one of the consequences of that loss of a fundamental underpinning led Europe to swing radically to political extremes. You know, the Nazis were, to think of the Nazis without thinking of that as a religious transformation is, like, that's just not right. It was a religious transformation, and it wasn't a good one. So, like, it was a regression in some sense to a morality that was way pre-Christian. Like you say, it was not good. And then, you know, you had the same, it was like the rise of the state as an alternative to God. Well, we saw what that produced. It produced hundreds of millions of painful deaths, and it just about destroyed the world. So it was a bad problem. And, you know, we sort of skirted our way through that miraculously, you know. I don't really think World War II came to an end until 1989, you know, because there was the whole Cold War period after the Germans and the Japanese had surrendered. But I mean, we just went from one war to another. We just went to another one that everyone was too afraid to fight. It was still a war, you know, and that didn't end until 1989. And by some miracle, God only knows why, you know, it never degenerated into a thermonuclear exchange. And it was close, man. We just barely squeaked through that. There were two times during that period. One in 1964, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where they had those bloody ICBMs primed. And so the way they worked was in the control panel, which kind of looked like a Star Trek, you know, the old Star Trek sets. There would be like a panel here, and there was a little place you could put a key. Then about 20 feet over there, there'd be another guy with a key. And if he turned his key and held it for 10 seconds at the same time he turned his key and held it for 10 seconds, then the missile launched. And an intercontinental ballistic missile is a bullet, and I mean that technically. It's not a guided missile. Once you launch it, like you shoot a bullet, it's gone. You don't get to tell the bullet to come back once it's gone. You can turn around like a cruise missile. An intercontinental ballistic missile, it goes where you aimed it, and you don't get to bring it back. And so during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the keys were in the locks. So we were 10 seconds away. Man, I tell you, that was a tight keyhole. We barely squeaked through that one. And it looks like by about 1989, the collective consciousness, or Jung would say the collective unconscious of the human race, had decided that, well, maybe having it all end in like apocalyptic annihilation wasn't necessarily for the best. It's interesting because writers like Goethe, he wrote Faust, and Faust is this tale of a man who makes a bet with the devil so that he can acquire infinite knowledge, essentially. And the devil in Faust is named Mephistopheles. And Goethe was trying to explain what human evil, or evil per se, what its motive was. And he did a lovely job. It's so smart what he said. He said, the devil's basic hypothesis, and of course Goethe expresses this in poetry, is that life is so unbearably cruel and random and tragic that it would be better if it had never existed at all. And you know, you believe me, there'll be times in your life where you think that, you know, where something has just knocks you off your feet in a completely unjust manner, you know. And that thought, it'll rise up, and like it's a compelling thought, and I think that's the thought that human beings were wrestling with. Well, we've been wrestling with it forever, but we didn't really vote on it till 1989. You know, and life barely won. And you know, life is a troublesome business. It's tragedy, and you know, everyone asks himself now and then is if their consciousness is worth the pain. Well, the answer to that is it depends on how you live. That is the answer to that. But you know, that's a complicated answer, and just because you know that answer doesn't mean that you know how to live.
Dr. Peterson, I listened to a number of your online talks, and I was thinking, what will I ask you? And this is a question that's been going through my mind. It's a two-pronged question. So, number one, I've been thinking, you know, how can a post-Christian world stand up to the encroachment of the social justice movement? So that's number one. And number two, I'm wondering, what is your where do you stand in terms of your spirituality?
Okay, I'll answer the second question first. Watch my videos. And that's the best I can do. So if you watch, I have a course online called Maps of Meaning. There's 40 hours of lectures, and that explains it. And I cannot simplify that. Now I can simplify it to some degree. I guess I'm wrong. I can simplify it to some degree. So there's a principle at the heart of Western civilization, and it's older than Christianity, and it's older than Judaism, although both Judaism and Christianity developed it to a great degree. The Jews especially with the prophetic tradition, and the Christians more with the metaphysical idea of the Word. And so the idea is, it's the idea of the logos, and the logos is also the root word of logic. But logos means something like coherent, interpersonal communication of the truth. And from an archetypal perspective, it's the action of the logos that extracts order from chaos, and that's really the meaning of the first chapter of Genesis. And it's an old idea. It's embedded in Mid-Eastern mythologies that might be, we don't know, tens to hundreds of thousands of years old. And the idea is that what being is a chaotic admixture it's a chaotic admixture. And the way that human beings interact with that and make it habitable is through articulated truth. We make order with articulated truth, and then we inhabit the order. And the order is the negotiated social agreement that we've all come to, right? So that we can live among each other without tearing each other to shreds, which is basically what chimpanzees do to one another. So we have to negotiate the social order, and we do that through articulated speech. And then what Christianity did was take that proposition, which was derived partly from Mesopotamia and partly from Judaism, partly from Egypt, and turn it into what would you call it, a symbolic doctrine. And so they took the figure of Christ, who's the ideal man from an archetypal psychological perspective, just means the ideal man. Right? So it's an image of the ideal. The ideal is the Word made flesh, and what that means is the
instantiation of the Logos in the body so that it's acted out in the world. It's the fundamental proposition of Western culture. And we've lost it. And we will not survive without it. And that's why people like Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky, when they were talking to the Russians, they said, look, the proper course of Russian development is to return to Russian Orthodoxy and to develop it forward into the future. A very difficult thing to do because the fundamentalist Christians, particularly, but I would say the Christians in general, can't distinguish between their truth claims and the truth claims of science. And they tend to insist at a philosophical level that the truths that are embedded in mythological structures are of the same type as scientific truths. And they're not. Scientific truths are descriptions of what is, right? Mythological truths, religious truths, are descriptions of being and guidelines to what ought to be. So you can say that there's two things you need to know in the world. One is what is. That's the objective world. What's the objective world? But that's only half of what you need to know. The other half is what you should do about it. And that's the primary existential issue. How to act in the world. Well, religious doctrine is about the world as a place to act. It's not about the world as a place of objects. That's science. And there's no contradiction between the two, except that we don't have the philosophical discrimination to distinguish between them. Now, Heidegger started to do that with his analysis of being. But that wasn't, he didn't do that within a Christian framework. But for all intents and purposes at the moment, that's irrelevant. Jung started to do it, Carl Jung. And Carl Jung, you see, Carl Jung was a student of Nietzsche, and also Freud. Now, Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced back in the late 1800s that God was dead. And when you know that, quote, Nietzsche said God was dead, but what you don't know probably is the context within which he said that in The Gay Science. He said, I paraphrase, God is dead and we have killed him and we will never find enough water to wash away the blood. It wasn't a triumphalist statement on Nietzsche's part. He predicted that millions of people would die in the 20th century as a consequence of the ascendance of communist ideology. He predicted that in like 1880. It's unbelievable. And Dostoevsky knew exactly the same thing and predicted that in The Devils, in his great book, The Devils. So we have no cornerstone in our culture. We've come unmoored. And we oscillate from the radical right, hyper-order, to the radical left, hyper-chaos. And millions of people die with each turn of the snake, let's say. We have got nothing to keep us centered. And what keeps people centered, whether they know it or not, is the Logos. They just don't understand what it means. Now, Carl Jung elaborated that in great detail in his unbelievably difficult and terrifying works, and did it brilliantly, brilliantly. But Jung is a hard nut to crack, and most people read him, and first they don't understand, and so they quit, and then if they start to understand, then they really quit. So, because the problem, the thing about the philosophy that's instantiated, say, in Jungian psychotherapy, in the Jungian model, is that it requires personal responsibility above all else. And one of the things I figured out a long time ago, so imagine you could give people a choice. Here's your choice, people. On the one hand, your life is meaningless. You're just a speck in a cosmic landscape, and the brief time that you inhabit being is worth nothing. That's one option. And people think, well, that's a terrible option, that's a nihilistic option. How can I tolerate the suffering that's attendant on my life with no countervailing meaning? Perfectly reasonable question. Here's the alternative. Everything you do matters. Everything you do matters. And you have to bear the responsibility for that. Every decision you make determines the destiny of the cosmos. That's meaning. Now, which one do you want? Well, that's easy. People will take meaninglessness and nihilism over that burden any day. I wish I had a meaningful life. It's like, well, really? Do you? Really? Really? You're prepared to bear, let's say, infinite responsibility for each of your choices, because that's meaningful. So no, people will shrink away from that. And no wonder they shrink away from that like animals shrink away from a fire, and it's perfectly understandable, but we don't get to shrink away from that anymore. Not without their being held to pay.
We're running out of time.
Is the problem with the term God? Though the people think of God as being a man. They think of it being a person. They even use the masculine pronouns in reference to God. I mean, that's one of the funniest things about God, is calling him a he.
Well, it's a problem. I mean, and that's certainly been a problem. Jung talked about that a lot, about the the exclusion of the feminine within the domains of classic Judeo-Christian thought, for example. I mean, you have Mary, who's a kind of a quasi-deity who pops in sort of like as a fourth member of the Trinity, but the exclusion of the feminine is definitely a conceptual problem. Is the fact that God is conceptualized as a human being or as a man a problem? It's a problem and a solution. I mean, if you remove the human element of God, then God gets so abstract that it's easy for him to float off into space and to never show up again. You lose the human connection. I mean, the way the Catholics solve that to some degree is that they have God who's sort of at the top of the hierarchy, and then they have this hierarchy of saints who are sort of like gods but half human, and then they have human beings at the bottom. And that allows for a, what would you say, a continual chain of communication between the highest level of abstraction and the actual, the actual concrete person. But the other thing that's useful about the conceptualization of God in anthropomorphic terms is that, and this is worth noting, is there is nothing more complex in the cosmos than a human being. So if you're looking for something to represent the ultimate in complexity, it's hard to beat a human being. So your brain is ungodly complicated, so to speak. So, I mean, these things are obviously too complicated to unpack in a
yeah, I didn't expect us to even get into this conversation, but I'm glad we did. Do you think that these stories exist because somewhere in our code, somewhere in our very being, we understand that there is a need for this order, to find this frequency?
Oh, they're an expression of our deepest being. They're an expression of how it is that we must live in order to live.
In order to reach our full potential.
Even more than that. More than that. Even to avoid hell. And you can think of you can think about hell as Nazi Germany if you want. You can think about it as the Soviet Gulag Archipelago or Mao's Cultural Revolution. Like, we can get there, no problem. If you walk down in some of the seedier areas in LA, you'll see people in hell, no problem.
Sure, go to Skid Row.
Yes, and you can tell when those people are there because they will get angry if you look at them. And you'll walk a big berth around them. You're not going to come within 10 feet of the, let's call it, psychogeography of their existence. Right, and that they're in a place. It's a metaphysical place, but it's not defined by the damn geography.
Right.
Skid Row is as much of a psychological place as it is a physical place. In fact, it's more a psychological place, but that doesn't make it any less a place. And if you're descend into the hell of Skid Row deep enough, you'll get to the point where most of your thoughts are murderous. And that's hell as a suburb of the underworld fundamentally. That place exists. People visit it all the time, and sometimes they don't get out. It's real.
I've been discussing this a lot recently because people like to talk about the concept of apocalypse, that we're headed towards an impending apocalypse. And my thought is that apocalypse is already here. It's just not right here.
Yeah, it's always here.
Go to Liberia. Go to Liberia and look at people defecating in the streets and eating human flesh. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen the Vice piece on Liberia, but it's unbelievably terrifying how people live there.
The apocalypse is an archetypal idea, and the apocalypse is always here. And it's here at the micro level. Like when we have a discussion and our concepts change, those are micro apocalypses. Little bits of our being are being blown apart and restructured. And that can happen at a small scale or a large scale, or it can get to the point where everything collapses and is destroyed. And life is apocalyptic in that matter because we all get sick, we all die, our families are vulnerable. There's an apocalyptic element to being, and we have to face that and confront it and deal with it properly. And the wrong way to deal with it is to generate more hell than heaven, I suppose, and to do that consciously. And people do that all the time too. There's never a situation that's so bad that there isn't something you can do to make it worse. And there's very seldomly a time when you're not motivated at some level of your being to put the knife in and twist it just one more quarter turn. People are like that. And we have reason. Life is hard. It's no wonder people get corrupted by it. It's not an easy thing to live in a... It's not an easy thing to live, let's say, in a truthful manner. But the alternative is hell. I mean, part of the reason that I made these videos to begin with was because, you know, I learned a lot about the importance of spoken truth as the countervailing force against tyranny and authoritarianism. It isn't an alternative political structure that's the countervailing force. It's spoken truth that's the countervailing force. It's like, well, why would I put my job on the line to have an opinion about compelled pronouns? I know why. Because the ability to speak your truth is the bulwark against hell. And losing your job, that's nothing. That's nothing compared to where things can go when they go badly. For me, it was just preventative. It's like, this isn't going in a good direction. Well, should you take a risk? It's like, you don't have that choice. You're silent, that's a risk. Now, most people don't understand the risks of silence. I happen to understand the risks of silence because I've been studying them for 40 years. In Dostoevsky's book, Crime and Punishment, he has his main character, Raskolnikov, decides that he's going to commit a murder, and he has very good justification for the murder. And Dostoevsky's very good at this. He puts his characters into very, very difficult moral situations and gives them full justification for pursuing pursuing the pathway that they're pursuing. And so Raskolnikov, he's broke and starving. He wants to go to law school. His sister's about to prostitute herself, roughly speaking, by marrying a guy that hates her, that she hates, and he has contempt for her, or at least acts in that manner. He's trying to rescue his mother as well, who's also in dire financial straits. He goes to a pawnbroker to pawn his meager possession so that he can continue to scrape by. And she has this niece, I believe it's her niece, that's not very bright, who she basically treats as a slave and is horrible to. And so the pawnbroker has this money. Raskolnikov is in dire need. He thinks, look, I'll just kill her, because why the hell not? I'll take her money. She's not doing any good with it anyways. I'll free her niece, who's just lurking as a slave. She's got all these other people tangled up in her pawnbroker schemes. All that'll happen is the world will be a better place. And the only thing that's holding me back is conventional moral cowardice. And, you know, Dostoevsky has his character in Crime and Punishment go through days, hours and days and weeks of intense imagination about this, rationalization about this, trying to justify himself, placing himself outside the law so that he can perpetrate this act, and telling himself with all the best nihilistic arguments that the only possible thing that could be holding him back is an arbitrary sense of indoctrinated morality. And so Dostoevsky explores that. He does commit the murder, and then of course all hell breaks loose because things don't necessarily turn out the way that you want. He gets away with it, however. Well, he gets away with it technically because no one knows he did it. But he doesn't get away with it in relationship to his own conscience. And so the rest of the book explores that. Well, Dostoevsky, I believe it was in Crime and Punishment, although he makes the same point in many of his books, he makes a very fundamental point. And this is the kind of point that I think that people who haven't investigated these matters down this particular literary and philosophical pathway never grapple with. Dostoevsky said straightforwardly, if there's no God, so if there's no higher value, let's say, if there's no transcendent value, then you can do whatever you want. And that's the question that he's investigating. And you see, this is why I have such frustration, say, with people like Sam Harris, the sort of radical atheists, because they seem to think that once human beings abandon their grounding in the transcendent, that the plausible way forward is with a kind of purist rationality that automatically attributes to other people equivalent value. It's like, I just don't understand that. They believe that that's the rational pathway. What the hell is irrational about me getting exactly what I want from every one of you whenever I want it at every possible second? Why is that irrational? And how possibly is that more irrational than us cooperating so we can both have a good time of it? I don't understand that. I mean, it's as if the psychopathic tendency is irrational. There's nothing irrational about it.
It's pure naked self-interest. How is that irrational? I don't understand that. Where's the pathway from rationality to an egalitarian virtue? Why the hell not every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost? It's a perfectly coherent philosophy. And it's actually one that you can institute in the world with a fair bit of material success if you want to do it. So I don't see, to me, I think that the universe that people like Dawkins and Harris inhabit is so intensely conditioned by mythological presuppositions that they take for granted the ethic that emerges out of that as if it's just a given, a rational given. And this, of course, precisely not Nietzsche's observation as well as Dostoevsky's. That's Nietzsche's observation. You don't get it. The ethic that you think is normative is a consequence of its nesting inside this tremendously lengthy history, much of which was expressed in mythological formulation. You wipe that out. You don't get to keep all the presuppositions and just assume that they're rationally axiomatic. To make a rational argument, you have to start with an initial proposition. Well, the proposition that underlies Western culture is that there's a transcendent morality. Now, you could say that's a transcendent morality instantiated in the figure of God. That's fine. You could even call that a personification of the morality. If you don't want to move into a metaphysical space, I'm not arguing for the existence of God. I'm arguing that the ethic that drives our culture is predicated on the idea of God, and that you can't just take that idea away and expect the thing to remain intact mid-air without any foundational support. I feel comfortable there because I've mastered the situation and I'm not in danger. So that's one domain of reality. Mm-hmm. And another domain is the unknown. And the unknown is, symbolically, it's often nature as opposed to culture, say, but it's more complex than that because the unknown can manifest itself at any moment when you act in a certain way and you desire an outcome and that outcome doesn't happen. Then the unknown manifests itself. And the unknown is, you could call it transcendent in some sense because it's beyond what we know, obviously, and it's also unbelievably complicated. And we have one part of our nervous system, so to speak, that deals with the realm of the known, mm-hmm. and the other part of our nervous system, mostly that deals with negative emotion, deals with the unknown. And it's negative emotion and fantasy. So you might say, well, there's the known world, then there's the unknown world, but there's a bridge between the two. And that bridge is the dream or mythology. It's something like that, is metaphor. That's another way of thinking about it. And it's sort of half known and half unknown. It's this amorphous bridging point. And our knowledge structures, our articulated knowledge structures, are embedded in that dream. So here's an example. Yeah. Western democracies are predicated on the idea that individuals have an intrinsic value, essentially intrinsic value before God, because it's an equal value. Everyone's equal before the law. Even though we're very unequal as beings, we have this mythological idea, essentially. It's not rational precisely. It's more like an axiomatic assumption. It's something like that there's something intrinsically valuable about each person. Mm-hmm. And it isn't something you can prove. It's something you have to assume and then go from there. Now, the reason we assume that is very complicated. I think it's not arbitrary. See, one of the things I was trying to figure out in this book called Maps of Meaning was there was this huge fight going on between the Marxists, the communists, and the Western world. Mm-hmm. And one way of thinking about that is that it's a clash of opinions. It's just a matter of opinion. So I was trying to find out if there was something at the base of Western culture that might be considered more than mere opinion, more mm-hmm. than mere rational opinion, grounded, say, well, what I think is grounded in this dreamlike process, but then grounded in biology, grounded in the body, grounded in evolutionary psychology, grounded in our entire biological past. And so I've been trying to make a case for the evolutionary psychology of religious propositions. That's one way of thinking about it.
So this bridge that you're talking about between these two worlds, how much of that bridge is really just the biggest existential questions that there are?
Well, it is that, because one of the things I've noticed as a clinical psychologist too, when you deal with really serious issues, say
issues of good and evil. And you might think, well, do you deal with issues of good and evil as a clinical psychologist? And the answer to that is, in serious cases, almost inevitably, so with post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, if it's a soldier who's experienced it, or for that matter, a civilian, it's not often so much because of what happened to them, although that can happen. It's because of what they did. They see them doing something, say on the battlefield or in normal life, that they cannot believe they did. It's so far outside of their self-concept. It opens them up to a different dimension of reality, and I would say that dimension is the dimension of evil.
Yeah. Meaning that they killed someone, or that they made a mistake, or so that they're basically sort of turning it on themselves, and that's
well, maybe they killed someone in a particularly brutal manner and enjoyed it, for example, you know, or maybe they went into My Lai, you know, you remember in Vietnam where they shot up the entire village. I mean, you don't know what you'd be like on a battlefield, but you wouldn't be like you are sitting here, right? You'd be a different thing. You'd be a different creature.
Yeah.
And I mean, one example is that, you know, men often rape in battle. But sex is very seldom a public display, although it can be in battle. Well, to my way of thinking, that means there's a whole different neural circuit involved under those conditions. It's much more brutal. And you know, you have a self-concept. Imagine that you're like a mid-American guy, you know, a young kid, basically. You get shipped off somewhere and do something absolutely barbaric. How do you fit that into your conception of the world? One of the things you do with people who have post-traumatic stress disorder is guide them to find a philosophy of good and evil, because otherwise they can't orient themselves again in the world.
Yeah.
So they have to become more sophisticated, and really they have to become more metaphysically sophisticated. And it's very common, in my experience, for an encounter with malevolence. And so I would describe malevolence as the desire to hurt for the sake of the hurt, right? As an art, really. And it's often an encounter with malevolence that breaks people. I had a client at one point, I'll say she was in college. She was bullied very badly by two kids that were out to get her. And she was so unable to cope with conceptualizing what they were doing, because it was, one of them had asked her out and she decided no, and he decided he would make her life miserable. And she was a naive girl, which matters, right? Because you're more likely to get post-traumatic stress disorder if you're naive. And the malevolence that the two displayed tossed her into a psychotic break. And that's not so uncommon. So when you talk about serious things in psychotherapy, you end up speaking what's essentially a religious language. It's a language of the war between good and evil. It's a huge part of it.
So do you think that right now in 2017, as we stand here on, I think today's May 5th, that we're at a strange place related to both of these worlds you're talking about? Because I sense that what's happening here is that we don't trust the news sources anymore in the way that we used to. We don't trust the politicians in the way we used to. We are all catering information to ourselves online, all of this stuff, so that our known world, what we would describe as this world right here, that I think is starting to fray a little bit. Do you agree with that premise?
Yes.
And what do you think that means for our ability to cope with the other world?
Well, part of what makes people peaceful, because we like to think we're peaceful, but we're not. We're neither peaceful nor anxiety-free. In fact, I would say that the normative human being is just as much terrified and murderous as calm and collected. Everything has to be right for you to be calm and collected. Now, the reason you and I can sit here and talk is because we share a very large number of assumptions. And so I don't really see you. I see this facade for this time that you're manifesting out of politeness and because you're socialized.
Yeah.
And you see that of me. And that means that we're two primates who can sit here and have a discussion without it breaking down into anything resembling, say, violence.
Right, but very quickly you could whip out a knife and the whole game would change.
Oh, yes,
and you'd
yes.
see how quickly my facade would disappear. There's
a fantastic scene in a book by Dostoevsky called The Possessed, or The Devils, which is a great book, by the way. It's one of the books that outlines where we're headed, I would say, even though it was written more than 100 years ago.
because it's about people who are possessed by an ideology that's very much like the social justice ideology that's emerged again. There's one scene in there, I think the character's name is Stavrogan, but he's breaking down because these belief systems are starting to shift around, and he isn't sure how to conceptualize himself. And at one point, I may have the character's name wrong, he goes into this club, you know, it's like an elite aristocratic club, and there's an old general sitting in there, and he grabs him by the nose and pulls him out onto the street, which, you know, in one sense, it's not a particularly brutal thing to do, but it's such a violation, it was such a violation of the social norm that it just caused absolute outrage. And that's a good example. It's like I wouldn't have to be particularly different. I wouldn't have to pull out a knife in order to destabilize the conversation.
Right.
There's lots of subtly strange things that you could do or that I could do that would put a real undercurrent into the conversation. You can experience that sometimes if you ever happen to talk to someone who's psychopathic and you get a sense of that that's actually what they're like. There's videos online of Paul Bernardo, and I would recommend that people take a look at those because they'll give you some sense of what can be bubbling underneath the surface.
Yeah.
So part of the reason that belief systems regulate people's emotions, aggression and fear, let's say, and disgust, many emotions, is because we act them out in the world. And as long as we're both acting out the same set of assumptions, then we can get what we want from each other because we can predict each other's behavior and we can cooperate easily. We can even compete because we know the rules of competition. But if that shared structure starts to fall apart, then I don't know what you're going to be like.
So that I think gets to what my question is, that I sense that that's starting to fall apart. I think the basic societal norms, the way we react to each other, it has a lot to do with social media and how we, you know, the outrage machine and how we destroy each other and judge each other. And I see some of this now leaking out into Antifa violence and that, you know, that the trust in our institutions is so low that I think all of the things that we've been basing our democracy on for the last, certainly for at least the last 50 years, they seem to be frayed right now. And I'm wondering, as you're saying this, what would you, it almost seems to me you'd only have to give it a light tap to really unfurl so much.
Well, I think, you know, a nice economic collapse like 2008 would do it. And I think that's the sort of thing that happened in Nazi Germany in the 20s and the 30s. You know, it wasn't just brutalized men back from World War I, and it wasn't just the conflict between communism and fascism. I mean, communism was a real threat, right, because the Russian Revolution had just occurred. It was also an absolute economic collapse. I mean, we can't even really imagine that, and it would be, in some sense, far worse today because the machine is more complex and people are farther away from primary sources of food, for example. So, yeah, we could get unlucky, and in the present state of chaos, dawning chaos, then things could fall apart badly.
I'm curious, when you first were writing the book, and as you said, it was over the course of many years and many hours a day, did you sort of see this leading to kind of where we are right now? Like right now that you're kind of in this in a very intimate way, your whole life has sort of led to this, and we're going to get to, you know, these crazy people that are protesting you and all that sort of stuff. But did you sense that if this thing didn't get corrected, that we would end up
Well, at
right
that
here?
point, it's a complicated question. I didn't really foresee the degree to which ideas like equity, for example, equality of outcome, would come roaring back. That's really quite shocking to me. I still don't know what to make of that. And it's happening so rapidly that I can hardly believe it, and with so little opposition. I did think, though, and that was from reading Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn, I suppose, to some degree, that without the proper cornerstone in place, the building can't stay up. And that was Nietzsche's point about the death of Christianity, right? He believed firmly that because Christianity had been criticized, in some sense, out of existence, that the foundations had been taken out from underneath the culture, and that it was going to either fall or rigidify, or fall and rigidify. I mean, you might think about those as responses on the left and on the right. And that struck me as very credible, because one of the things Nietzsche said was that what you don't understand about Western civilization is that it's a coherent metaphysics. It's predicated on the idea of the existence of God, and then of also the incarnation, let's say. And those are the dreamlike foundations of the entire building, and if you remove those, then it becomes a matter of opinion. And in some sense, that's what the postmodernists are claiming, that it's just a matter of opinion, or they say it's a matter of power, right? Because that's a huge claim on their part.
So I've had this discussion, this very point, with a couple people, some who are believers like Dennis Prager, and some who are not believers like Sam Harris. Do you think, if I go with you on the premise of what you're saying, within that system, I assume you believe that the individual themselves could be a non-believer and a perfectly productive part of society, right? It's just that the institutions...
Only for a time.
Really?
Yeah, I think that, it's like we're living in the corpse of a whale, There's lots to eat, but that's because there was a whale. And once we eat the whole whale, then, well, there's not going to be much left. People like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, they assume that the natural person is the civilized creature that you see before you in a discussion like this. But I don't believe that. I think that people are far crazier and far more destructive and far greater as well than the typical rationalist approach. Rationality is a surface facade. That's all. And the idea that people will eventually be rational, it's much more likely that they will be irrational than rational. And you could say, for example, that Catholicism, let's say, for all its irrationality, was as rational as people can get. If you remove that level of irrationality, that's structural, say, then everything falls apart and people get so irrational, you can't believe it. Not more rational. Because they, like Harrison and his crowd, think that we were superstitious for thousands of years. Kind of savage and superstitious. And then all of a sudden the Enlightenment came along in the scientific revolution, and poof, we got rational. And since then things have been good. And that's not how it looks to me at all. I don't buy that. I think that our rationality, as I said already, our rationality, even our science, is nested inside this larger metaphysical structure. This is also something that Carl Jung would be an advocate of. That there's an irrational, pragmatic, I would say evolutionarily determined ethic underneath this rationality. And when it goes, then all that rationality goes too. So, yes, you can be a non-believer, but the funny thing about that is too, you can't be a non-believer in your action, you see, because Harris's metaphysics is fundamentally Christian. So he acts out a Christian metaphysics, but he says, well, I don't believe it. It's like, well, yeah, you do, because you're acting it out. You just say you don't believe it, but you believe it.
What do you mean he's acting it out? Like what, for example?
Well, he doesn't rob banks, doesn't kill people, doesn't rape, doesn't murder, I mean, look, in Crime and Punishment, for example.
So you think when you don't do those things, basically the underpinning of it, even though I think, I can't speak for Sam, and you guys have had, by the way, regardless of where we get with this, you guys have had, I think, two great conversations, one where you didn't quite get there, but one where you've come together, and I suspect you both really relish in that, right? I mean, at the end of the day, this is someone that you respect, whether you disagree with or not.
Look, I mean...
Yeah, I just think that's important to preface, because everyone is so at each other's throats all the time, that when I saw two people that I respect just disagreeing on things, but really trying to get there, I thought, this is good. And yet there's a certain amount of people that that want you guys to tear each other apart.
Well, there's a good case to be made for atheism. I mean, let's make no bones about it. I actually think it's an easier case to make than the alternative. Because you could say, in some sense, there's been 300, 400 years of brilliant scientists who've been doing nothing but laying the foundation for an objective, empirical atheism. So it's an unbelievably powerful argument. But it's not going to lead to the rule of rationality. See, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. Because
do you think anything could get you there? Do you think that somebody could lay out a case that could eventually turn you on this the same way you would want someone like Sam to come around to what you're saying? Do you think that that's even in the realm of possibility?
I can't see how, because it's not like I haven't thought these things through. I mean, I am a scientist. You know, I understand the scientific worldview. In fact, everything that I am saying and thinking about religion is nested inside an evolutionary viewpoint, an evolutionary biology viewpoint, and an evolutionary psychology viewpoint. So I do believe there's a fundamental contrast between a Darwinian worldview and a Newtonian worldview, which is the worldview that I think Sam Harris and his crowd basically have. He didn't agree with that, and it's complicated.
Yeah.
But see, I guess in some sense, I'm more romantic in temperament than Sam, and I think than his followers too. And because of that, I can see the irrational and malevolent side of human beings, I believe, much more clearly than they can. And I also think I have far more experience with that sort of thing.
Yeah, so do you think that, so I don't want to get too lost here, but
yeah.
So we'll try to wrap it up here because there's so much I want to do with you here. So let's say Earth is crumbling, we have two ships. We're going to send the people that believe what you're saying here, basically, that we need this sort of religious underpinning. And then the Dawkins, Sam people, they're going to take their 100 people, you're going to take your 100 people. We're going to go to two different planets and set things up the way they should be. You know, blank slate for each. I guess the part that I would struggle with here is to understand how their ship lands. They're rooted in science and in basic liberalism and acceptance of others and all that. How that society would not flourish from the base level if we could just reset. Now, I think you could make a great argument that we can't do it here because there's just so much history here and all that stuff. But if we were just resetting on another place, why could we not do it that way and have it work?
Well, first of all, you know, there's an assumption that science and the scientific worldview in some sense has won. You know, and because it's so self-evident, let's say, because of what it can produce, that people just will accept it and move forward with it. But I'm not sure about that either. I mean, I think there's a strong anti-science movement afloat now. I don't think there's any reason to assume that a scientific attitude of that sort would be stable. I mean, it's only 300 years old, yeah. 400. I mean, people don't like it when I say that because, okay, fine, you can chase it back to some degree to the ancient Greeks, you know, barely.
Right.
But really, it was Newton and Bacon and Descartes, and that's not very long ago. And we take it for granted, but there's anti-science movements popping up. Well, look, the whole debate over biology to some degree is profoundly an anti-science movement, and not unconsciously so, consciously so.
Yeah,
right?
very consciously.
Yes, very
so,
consciously so.
Yeah.
So I don't think that there's any reason to assume something like that would be stable. There's no evidence that it's stable, let's say, whereas there is evidence for the stability of cultures that were non-scientific for thousands of years, millions of years for that matter, at least hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah.
So
there was a lot of war and death involved in those cultures too, but that's sort of...
Yes, definitely.
But I guess that would be your argument, is that this is just the nature of this battle between these two worlds that we live in.
Yeah, well, you know, the other thing that often happens with Dawkins and Harris and their crew is that they attribute war and conflict to religious motivations. You know, and I find that quite interesting because, first of all, chimpanzees go to war. So, you know, we could just lay that right on the table and say, well, so much for the religious theory. They're territorial. We're territorial. You could consider religious sentiment as an aspect of territoriality, but the fundamental motivation for the battle is territorial. And that's grounded in, like you can see that in animals always. Mm-hmm. So that was only discovered, you know, the chimps went to war in about mid-70s, and Goodall suppressed it for quite a while because she thought maybe she had warped the chimpanzees by provisioning them, and so that they were manifesting abnormal behavior. But they were studied for quite a while, and they do raiding, and they'll wipe out another colony, no problem, and brutally. They seem to have absolutely no inhibitions on their aggression whatsoever. They'll tear them into pieces. And chimpanzees are about 6 times as strong as an adult male. They're super strong, and so when they let loose, they're vicious with no control. And so, unless you're willing to attribute religious sentiment to the chimpanzees,